Thank you for joining us for our JINSA program. We are honored to have joining us today Aliyah Benjamin, the Honorable Mary Beth Long, Ambassador J. Peter Pham, and Jonathan Rui. Mr. Benjamin is head of the Middle East Bureau at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Israel. The Honorable Mary Beth Long is former U.S. Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs and a member of JINSA's Abraham Accords Policy Project. Ambassador Pham is was U.S. Special Envoy for the African Great Lakes and the Sahel region of Africa. And this program will be moderated by Jonathan Rui, Director of Foreign Policy at JINSA. The panel will be discussing Israel-Morocco ties in U.S. policy. During the webinar, you may submit questions through the Q&A box on your screen. For those in the audience, you're automatically muted and your video is off. I would like to invite Jonathan to start the discussion.
Great. Thank you, Harris. And thank you to everyone who's taken time out of their busy schedules to join today. And thank you in advance to all our panelists for taking time as well to share their thoughts. As Harris mentioned, we're going to talk about the Israel-Morocco relationship and broader policy concerns. By quick way of backgrounder, in late 2020, Morocco joined the historic Abraham Accords, which normalized ties among various Arab states with Israel. And as Harris mentioned, JINSA has an Abraham Accords policy project, which released a comprehensive report in January. And as he mentioned, Secretary Mary Beth Long was a member of that group. More recently, late last year, and this has gone into in depth in JINSA's work, Israel and Morocco signed the first ever defense agreement between the Jewish state and its Arab neighbors. Yet now, U.S. policy toward the region in North Africa has been somewhat ambivalent, perhaps to say most charitably, even as China, Russia, and Iran make inroads in the region. So we'll be discussing both the bilateral Israel-Morocco partnership, but also broader regional concerns and how they might fit into U.S. policy and strategy. Before I get into a moderated Q&A with our panelists, I'd like to leave a little bit of time at the outset for some opening remarks from each of our panelists if they so choose. Ambassador Pham, I'd like to kick things off with you if there's anything you'd like to say to open the conversation up.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. And it's a privilege as well as a pleasure to be here with not only you, but two old friends, Secretary Mary Beth Long and Aliyah Benjamin, whom I've known for a number of years and the pleasure of also working with on a number of projects over the years. So it's good to be here. And thank you for JINSA for convening this important discussion. I've long held that the United States, Israel, and Morocco, there were two partnerships there, the United States and Israel, which we all know about, and I don't need to get into great details about, but also the United States and Morocco. Morocco, many people don't know, is the U.S. has the oldest continuous treaty relationship with the U.S. of any country in the world. So the first country to recognize the sovereignty of the newly declared independent United States. And the Treaty of Friendship, which is still in force, was actually signed on behalf of the United States by Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. So that's how long this relationship is. It's a major non-NATO ally. And so I've always thought that there was a need and in fact, an opportunity to triangulate this instead of two bilaterals, to triangulate this relationship. And certainly with Morocco joining the Abraham Accord in 2020, that opened the space. And as you mentioned, with the first ever defense agreement between the state of Israel and one of its Arab neighbors. It's not surprising to me that this occurred because Morocco has long had this rather unique role, long before others had great tolerance. There was a good friend of mine, Serge Verdugo, was a minister, head of the Jewish community in Morocco, but a minister in the cabinet in the early 90s, long before the normalization we're very pleased to see today happening, was a twinkle in many people's eyes. The Moroccan constitution recognizes the Jewish as well as the Arab and African roots of the Moroccan nation. And finally, the final comment I would make is this is natural also because of the opportunities and the challenges that all three countries, Morocco, Israel, and the United States, find in Africa, which to me is the continent of the future of the 21st century for a number of strategic regions we can get into. And Morocco has very unique strengths. Israel has been re-engaging in recent years with Africa, expanding its diplomatic network, and this past year rejoining the African Union as with observer status. And of course, the United States has long had cultural, political, and strategic engagements, ups and downs, but there. So I think it's another opportunity, another forum for these three partners to work together. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Ambassador Pham. Secretary Long, I'd like to turn over to you for any opening comments.
I'm going to build on what the ambassador basically told us and reiterate what a very good Moroccan friend of mine told me over the last week. I have the privilege of being here. Thank you so much, JINSA, for doing this incredibly important work. It's great to see old friends and new friends. And it's great to have the opportunity to share the little bit that I've learned from my Moroccan friends, having been in a track 2 that's sponsored by them for quite some time about Iran. That includes actually the Russians, Chinese, and others. But from a Moroccan perspective, this was a no-brainer. And it's not just the fact that Morocco over the history, actually Morocco has a relationship with Israelis, or certainly the Jewish people, all the way back from the 2nd century. And prior to the establishment of Israel had almost, I think, encroaching upon 300,000 Jews who lived in Morocco, and as the ambassador said, had protected status even up until the modern age. And some would say that descendants of the Jews who lived in Morocco who are currently in Israel, I think they're approaching upon about the million person mark. But equally important, this is an opportunity that the monarchy sees as a personal issue. All the way back to the grandfather of the current king, King Hassan II, while he did not have a relationship formally with Israel at the time, served as the liaison between Israel and Egypt during very important negotiations that led to the Oslo Accords in the 70s. And this has been a sacred duty of the monarchy since then. The current monarch has a duty and in fact serves on, I believe, the Palestinian-Israel Committee to look after Palestine. And the king made a real point of, after this relationship was established, of putting all on notice that this is the way to recognize the two-state solution, and that he looks forward to using Morocco and using his relationship both with the Israelis and the Palestinians to perhaps use this event of the Arab nations taking the threat of conflict between the Arab nations and Israel off the table as a reset for Morocco and other countries to play an important role in resolving the Palestinian issue, as well as, secondly, to really confront Iran in Africa. From a Moroccan standpoint, the recognition of Moroccan territorial claims over the Sahara are key to Morocco combating the Polisario Front, which it believes is Iranian-backed, and securing for not only Morocco, but the rest of the Maghreb, the security of the Sahel, and dealing with important threats that are now resident with extremist Islamist violent groups on the Sahel, which are a big problem for all the southern borders. And then finally, recognition of Morocco's long-term role in being a quiet peacemaker and a gateway to the rest of Africa, both for promising Western initiatives, but also for Israeli and other efforts to penetrate Africa from an environment that has long recognized diversity and the rights of the Abrahamic people from the get-go. And I'll stop there.
Wonderful, thank you very much. Mr. Benjamin, I'd like to give you an opportunity to say any opening remarks you might like.
Thank you, Jonathan, and really this is a pleasure to join you all and to congratulate JINSA also for everything that you're doing, not just when it comes to Morocco, Israel relations, but first and foremost, Israel-US relations. and putting a big focus on the relations with our new friends and allies, in this case, the Moroccans, but also with the Abraham Accords countries in the Gulf, with UAE and Bahrain, is really important to us. I think the idea of showing this joint power and joint cooperation between Israel and the US, and in this case Morocco, I think is really has a strategic importance, not just to our three countries, but to the region at large. To show this, it's a show of power, it's a show of unity, and it's a show of joint interests, both vis-a-vis opportunities, but also dealing with the regional challenges that both Peter and Mary Beth addressed just earlier. And it really is a pleasure to rejoin some old friends through this webinar now. So this is great. For us, the relations with Morocco, and for most Israelis, it's so much also comes with an emotional background in a most positive way. We need to remember that there are probably between 1 million to 1.5 million Israelis who have Moroccan blood in their veins, and this is something that brings us also very closely together. The Jewish heritage in Morocco, the history, the places of worship, the families that are still there, the Jewish community that is still there, protected, guarded, and assisted by the king, by the palace, by the Moroccan neighbors and friends, is something that is really, it's part of the DNA of the relationship. The culture, the joint culture, is a big part of it. You come to Israel, you hear, Moroccan style music played back. This is part of who we are and what we are. Even if I don't necessarily have Moroccan blood in me, it's still integrated in all of us. And I think this is what makes the resumption and the upgrade of relations ever so more natural. When we and it really is, it's not just a resumption, it really is an upgrade of relations. We did have diplomatic relations between 95 and 2000 until the second Intifada. We had a representative office in Rabat, and they had the representative office here in Tel Aviv. For 20 years, unfortunately, these places were quiet, uninhibited. I'm talking about the actual missions. And then when we had the joint declaration, 22nd of December, 2020, this is really a huge thing. And one of the things that we do need to recognize and appreciate, and the Moroccans themselves are putting a lot of emphasis on this as well, and rightly so, is that this is a trilateral cooperation and a trilateral journey that we're all on together. And we need to understand this also when it comes to sensitivities from the Moroccan side. If we look at what we've achieved over the past just over a year bilaterally, I think it's quite impressive to see the number of the level of interaction, the government-to-government agreements, the visit of Minister Lapid in late August and the inauguration of our mission there, the visit of Minister Gantz in December. All these things are, part of what we're about and part of what this relationship is about. So a big part of it is the bilateral first and foremost, but then yes, as mentioned just earlier, we are looking at the region, and we're looking at the region both strategically when it comes to joint threats, whether it's ISIS, whether it's Iran, whether it's other proxies who are operating and threatening all of us. But it's also when it comes to economic and development opportunities vis-a-vis the AU, the African Union, but even regardless, neighboring countries, which not with all of them does Israel yet have full diplomatic relations. That's still work in progress. I'm not sure we'll finalize one by the end of this webinar, but it is something that we are working on very closely also with our Moroccan friends and colleagues. And I think Peter related to this earlier, seeing Morocco and Morocco rightly so portraying itself as a gateway to Africa is an opportunity for cooperation with Israel, again, on economic issues, on defense issues, on strategic issues, and on development issues, when it comes to the more underdeveloped countries in the region. So the sky is the limit, maybe even beyond, when it comes to the potential of relations. We are just at the beginning. We need to recognize also that it's only been a year, but the amount and the level of engagement, I think, is mind-boggling. We're expecting the inauguration of Royal Air Maroc flights, RAM, their direct flights to Israel starting next week. We're expecting a very large business delegation with CGM coming out to Israel next week as well. So there are a lot of things that are happening now. A lot of it is on the economic front. A lot of it is also on, things perhaps relate to people watching and listening on now when it comes to defense and military cooperation. Some of it has been out in the public. Some of it probably best kept under the table or behind closed doors. But these things are happening as well, and really we're working on many fronts. So thank you.
Thank you very much. And there's, in the collective comments we've heard thus far, there are plenty of issues I want to come back to and spool out a little bit more. But before we drill down into some of these more discrete issues and really look more prospectively at what the future holds, I'd like to start off my part of the Q&A with a question for Secretary Long, which is, I want to make sure we don't skip over the truly historic importance of the Abraham Accords. And this is something that comes through in JINSA's work on this subject. But Secretary Long, I would appreciate if you could sort of give us a little bit of background context or sort of a sense of the importance of the high ceiling for the Abraham Accords, which we heard reference to in the opening remarks. How are these a game changer for the broader Middle East? And we talk about the high ceiling they have. What does that mean, especially in the area of perhaps defense and security cooperation?
If you had asked me when I was in the building responsible for part of the Middle East whether I thought something like the Abraham Accords was possible beyond perhaps sub rosa intelligence sharing, perhaps some discussions about mutual defense, but also some real problems, accusations from the UAE and others about Israeli spying, a lot of suspicion, yet dialogue, but sub rosa again. If you had asked me whether it was possible for everyone to get on the same sheet of paper, I would have said it's not about issues with Judaism, and it's not really about issues with Israel. They have actually become much closer than people realize on the one hand. On the other hand, there is the Palestinian issue. And frankly, I told many, the Arabs aren't as interested in the Palestinian issue as people think. In fact, it's the United States that happens to raise it, and the Europeans more often than not. And the Arabs are over the fact that the Palestinian has used and abused the opportunities it had, that Palestinian leadership has proven to only miss the opportunities that it can miss opportunities, and that the corruption and the divergence of interest in that entity will actually finally unite all of these governments with one another. But I would not have anticipated that the Abraham Accords were possible, frankly. The fact that it happened the way that it happened and under the purview of the leadership, frankly, of the United States, the Israelis, and the UAE and others is phenomenal. And it came together, in fact, I believe, with the fundamental fact that the Arab countries recognize that Israel is no longer its greatest threat. It's no longer a threat that they even need to be worried about certainly not from a strategic or existential issue, and that the commonalities of threats is Iran all day, every day, extremists, and that they shared that view, and that was a motivating factor, that they could work together from a defense perspective, not only in saving time, money, and effort, and not being worried about defending themselves against each other, but they would work cooperatively and leverage their capabilities, leverage their tyranny of geography, and help protect each other, not just against the Iranians and not just against a nuclear capability, but against the rockets that Israel had been suffering from for decades, and from what the UAE and others anticipated to be rockets, drones, and missiles coming their way. And they were right, and they were prescient. And I think it's a game changer. Not only does it recognize the coincidence of strategic defense interests of the Israelis, the Jewish people, the Arabs and their countries, but it has served as almost a gate opener for the little sub rosa trade things that were happening behind the scenes, the cultural things that were happening behind the scenes, but also the sharing of intelligence that still, of course, is very controlled, but the sharing of real information and building collective defense, while not formal, but collective interpretations of what that region needs, to the enormous benefit, frankly, of the United States. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. And that actually is a great note to lead into my next question for Ambassador Pham, which is, we talked about the United States role in all this. Obviously, it's the Abraham Accords are normalization between Israel and certain US aligned Arab states. But we've heard so far in the discussion about bilateral versus trilateral, the role of the US in all this, and US-Moroccan relations going back many centuries, as you point out. So Ambassador Pham, I was wondering if you could sort of explain for us a little more in depth, sort of what you saw as the importance of the United States in helping usher in Israel-Morocco normalization, and then also sort of has the U.S. position changed in just the year and a half, shall we say, since Israel-Morocco normalization occurred?
Thank you, Jonathan. The U.S. role was clearly fundamental. We had this the situation, as Eliav pointed out, where there's a long history of Israel-Morocco cooperation, sometimes sub rosa, sometimes in the 90s, out in the open. And certainly that was the background that was laid even before that, with the history, the culture that links the two states. Mary Beth alluded to the king's father, Hassan II's role as head of the Jerusalem Committee of the Arab League, and the family's role. His grandfather, King Mohammed V's role during the Second World War, where he was pressured to hand over Jews in Morocco's Jewish community, and he refused. He said, what we have here are Moroccans, and refused to do that, and his role in saving that community. So that there's a history behind it, but to bring it to where it was, it required a trusted partner, and that's where certainly I think a great deal of credit to the previous U.S. administration working the issue very strongly. Our Ambassador David Friedman, who worked very strongly to bring things about. And it built upon the trust. I don't need to talk to this audience with JINSA on the U.S.-Israel defense relationship, but I think perhaps a few words about the Morocco-U.S. defense relationship, which is perhaps not as well known. For years, Morocco has been, since the Bush administration, when Mary Beth was at the Defense Department, has been a major non-NATO ally, recognized as such. The U.S. is the primary supplier of Morocco's defense needs. Some 90%, give or take, of Morocco's arms purchases come from the U.S., including, in just the last few years, things like 25 F-16 fighters adding to their fleet, Apache attack helicopters, and just at the very end of the Trump administration, in 2020, the U.S. and Morocco signed a 10-year military cooperation agreement, a roadmap to build an even stronger defense cooperation between the two. So it's this relationship that I think helped bring things about. Now, to help facilitate it, the U.S. did do something Morocco has long requested, and which is recognizing Moroccan sovereignty, which some of us academics would argue has always been there, Moroccan sovereignty over its southern provinces, the so-called Western Sahara. And that certainly helped facilitate the rapprochement between Morocco and Israel, giving something demonstrable to Morocco, not to induce it to do what its strategic interests and Israel's strategic interests brought together, but certainly helping facilitate that. Now, at the beginning of the Biden administration, there was an announcement that the administration, which includes a number of people who is known to be skeptical of Morocco's claims to the Western Sahara, announced a review of that declaration. But to date, there's been no withdrawal of that. There's been this review, which was supposed to take 2 weeks, and as no one has heard from since. But there have been private assurances that nothing has changed. Obviously, that has not satisfied everyone, and certainly there's some things going on in Congress with the defense authorization legislation, as well as some of the appropriations legislation that is an attempt legislatively to roll this back, but so far nothing's been done. But certainly that would be not a blow to the normalization that has occurred, but certainly to our role as an honest broker in that. And I would hope that that would not be the case.
Thank you. And Mr. Benjamin, I'd like to pivot to you now, staying in the framework of this idea of a trilateral US, Israel, Morocco potential for cooperation. We saw just earlier this year, I believe, the first time that Israel and Morocco have exercised together under US military auspices. And a big part of the work that JINSA has done, and obviously, I think equally important perhaps to the Abraham Accords, is the relocation of Israel from US European Command to US Central Command, which the latter of which deals with US forces and posture in the Middle East. But that's a way of asking the question to you. From the Israeli perspective, are these deepening defense ties with Morocco primarily still a bilateral approach, or do you see potential for this to bloom into something that is more multilateral with the United States involved?
It's a very good question, Jonathan, and it's something that we are working on extensively and not only bilaterally. So Israel is now part of CENTCOM, so part of AFCOM, but this is where Morocco, Israel, and US come into play in a great way. Morocco, I think, rightly so, sees itself as in a very central and strategic location in the region, as part also, I believe, as AFCOM, the African Command. The cooperation with Israel, whether it's through CENTCOM, whether it's through AFCOM, or any other constellation or configuration, is an opportunity to get to know each other, know how we each operate, even on the most tactical level, the type of language when it comes to tactical language, dealing with the challenges, whether it's air, whether it's sea, whether it's land. And these are part of the drills that have taken place. And I'm happy to say that, they got some publicity, things that in the past we wouldn't have even dreamed of happening, let alone it being public. So this is, I think, an important sign of its own. The fact that we're all going public with this, including the Moroccans, because I think the publicity of this, it's not just a PR thing. It's a strategic posturing and messaging of we're here, we're working together, be careful type of thing. And US military presence in I would say the Moroccan region is not its largest presence in the world, as we know, and it's part of the reason that Morocco sees itself as a key player. And I think that this too is where Israel comes into play on working together, not necessarily with boots on the ground, so to speak, but with joint training, cooperation when it comes to R&D on defense systems, acquisitions, and so on and so forth, and very much so on a trilat. But even more so, it's not just the three of us, it is very much so also regional. If we have the chiefs of staffs or J5s, the heads of J5s meeting in the region, this also not only sends a message, but it also means that we're strategizing together on how to deal jointly with the threats. And then, we each have our own missions of how we go about it, but we work on something more cohesive, which again sends a message. And without the US involvement and backing, not only as quarterbacking, but really even leading these things, I'm not sure that this could really take place.
Thank you. And that is a great segue into, I think, sort of the next part of the discussion, which is looking at shall we say, North Africa or the Maghreb, more regionally. Actually, I think this is an area that's, I think, fair to say, sort of woefully underappreciated and perhaps even misunderstood by a lot of even sort of foreign policy experts here in America. So I'd like to sort of now, if we can, sort of fill in some of those blanks. And I'd like to sort of go around the panel, so to speak, starting with you, Secretary Long. Could you give us some sense of sort of, is there growing security competition in North Africa, broadly conceived, perhaps to include everything from Morocco to Israel? Obviously, in the United States, there's a sort of a grand strategic discussion going on about the need to pivot to strategic competition, great power competition, choose your buzzwords. But does North Africa fit into this framework? Are we seeing sort of a rising security competition that can impinge on U.S. interests here?
We do. And actually, I would break it down really into four components. You have the Maghreb itself, which on the one hand, on each end, you've got Morocco with tremendous relations with Israel now. And on the other end, you have Egypt with tremendous relations with the Israelis and the Jewish people. But in the middle, you've got some murkiness. You've got Tunisia, that is always seems to be, or certainly since the Arab Spring, in one level of chaos internally, politically, and not moving, particularly in one direction or the other. You have Algiers, who cannot get itself and its leadership out of the 1950s, and is a threat, or certainly considered a threat, to Morocco. Morocco certainly believes that Algiers is a military threat and accuses the Algerians of supporting the Polisario Front, which is a destabilizing factor in the Western Sahara. You have Algeria that has doubled down, frankly, although it has fits and starts with its relationship with America from a defense and security relationship. It also does so with Russia. And you have Libya that is probably in the process of, at least from a normative sense, the East and West, perhaps formally, but all of these, in particular Libya, have also become a playground for proxy forces, including the Chinese, the Russians, the Qataris, the Turks, the United States, the French. So you've got a lot of instability and a lot of security threats, number one. Number two, all of these countries, of course, are on the Mediterranean, that from a European perspective, from a NATO perspective, represent immigration, refugees, displaced persons, and some real issues into the Med that NATO and or the European NATO members have to deal with these immigration flows, either through or from a lot of the Maghreb states. That's a problem that is exacerbated by the fact that you've got some territorial claims and some disputes regarding oil and gas deposits that are found in the Med, of which Israel is certainly a player. Then when you go to the great power competition, you've got the Belt and Road initiatives and China, of course, playing in Africa on a very large scale. Not so much yet with the Belt and Road in the Maghreb countries, but certainly a huge presence. The last time I was in Libya a year and a half ago, Chinese everywhere. You've got a lot of interest by the Chinese in those regions, even with Egypt. From a military standpoint, you've still got the Russians knocking on the door. And then finally, you've got terrorists, number four. You've got insurgent, Islamic violent extremists, certainly along the southern borders of all of those states, if not a sanctuary in Libya. So from a defense and security perspective, there's a lot of US interest there that frankly, as you pointed out, with our pivot and our attention to larger or perhaps greater power issues, and certainly with the violence in the Ukraine, we need all the help we can get to not only leverage, but substitute for US presence and US efforts with our Northern Africa colleagues, as well as the Europeans with presence there. And I'll stop.
Thank you. Ambassador Pham, is there anything you'd like to add on that score?
Well, I'll just pick up with what Mary Beth just spoke about. with the mentioning Libya, and of course, out of the chaos that ensued in Libya following the intervention of NATO and the collapse of the Gaddafi regime, the fighters and weapons that flowed out of Libya, much of it went south into the Sahel, threatening Niger, Chad, Mali, and continuing to go south. And we've seen that in the last few years. Large parts of Mali have been overrun by terrorists, some affiliated with Al-Qaeda's networks, some affiliated with the Daesh, and that has continued to, unfortunately, to march on into further south into Burkina Faso. And we've seen just in recent weeks attacks in Benin, infiltrations Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire. So countries that are on the West African Gulf of Guinea coast. This is spreading this instability, and that certainly gets to population centers. So we risk humanitarian challenges, destabilizing of friendly governments, as well as an area of great economic interest and opportunity, not just for the US, but also our partners in the region. Morocco, maybe people don't realize, is the largest African investor in West Africa and the second largest across the continent. So Morocco has key economic interests, but also it has, cultural suasion, relationships based on shared faith, history, the Sufi traditions of Islam in the region. But you also, as Mary Beth mentioned, also the great power competition, as well as middling and regional powers. Iran plays increasingly a very nefarious role in the region, where, go back 50 years, 60 years, there was no Shiism to be found. All of a sudden now you have people in various places parading down the streets carrying the Supreme Leader's portrait, Khomeini's portrait, and even in some places I've seen Hassan Nasrallah's portrait. That is certainly not an evolution to the good, whether it be of the region or of anyone's security interests. So there's a lot going on here. And unfortunately, some of our European partners in NATO who have certainly interests, as Mary Beth, on the migration, other issues, have also had some difficulties. Some of it, if we're being frank and friends should be candid, some of it self-caused or self-inflicted, including the French who have been kicked out of Mali, where on one hand, they were instrumental in stopping an advance of Islamist insurgents. On the other hand, they had not had a good strategy and certainly not a good political strategy, and may have exacerbated some of the issues. So we also have that. We have the phenomenon of coups in the region resulting in this instability. In the last year alone, we've seen coups in Mali, in Guinea, and most recently in Burkina Faso. So a lot of issues in this region that challenge us on the security strategic level.
I would just like to follow up very quickly, Ambassador Pham, on that point. So one thing that JINSA has looked at is U.S. interests in the Eastern Mediterranean, which in some ways is its own complex of security issues. But one thing that we kept hearing as a refrain from both the U.S. military and also those of our allies in the region is fears of sort of, for lack of a better term, Russian encirclement in the region, given their beachheads in Syria and as we discussed in Libya. Is it an overstatement to say we should also be worried, perhaps especially in light of recent events, that this may also be taking place in somewhere like Algeria, or is that perhaps a bridge too far at this point?
No, it's no secret. Algeria has long had a very a historic relationship, especially on the defense procurement side, training with the old Soviet Union, and certainly that has continued with the Russian Federation. There's no secret about that. And just as Morocco, it primarily gets its armaments, its doctrine training from the United States as a supplier, Algeria has turned eastward to Russia. That is there. But increasingly, I would probably is more hybrid warfare in the region. And that's the penetration of supposedly private operators, the Wagner Group, in places like the Central African Republic, where they've infiltrated such to the extent that the national security advisor of this African country has the very African name, and I'm being very facetious right now, of Valery Zakharov. Mali, where in the last year the Wagner Group has, and certainly in recent days, the #2 in the military regime in Sudan, where was he? But in Moscow. So there is, I think it's they've seen an opportunity, and this is where we have to give Africa its due and pay attention that its strategic importance deserves, because taking an eye off the ball, not paying attention, Russia doesn't have the wherewithal to be the major development or economic partner that the United States or other countries can be, but it certainly has enough rubles, even with the sanctions, to opportunistically get involved and for very low cost create mischief.
Thank you. I'd like to stick with this sort of broader regional sort of outlook and perspective for one more question for Mr. Benjamin. We sort of mentioned earlier in the discussion, Morocco as sort of a gateway to Africa, so to speak. And so, to Mr. Benjamin, do you see a lot of potential for Israel's developing ties with Morocco to sort of have compounding effects in a positive way with Israel's efforts to develop greater ties in Africa? Do you see a potential there, or is this more limited to the Israel-Morocco relationship itself?
I definitely see potential there, potential which we are already beginning to realize with, baby steps in this regard. But I think that we need to look at this also, and this relates to what both Peter and Mary Beth raised earlier, is looking at the superpowers of the world, or I don't know whether that's superpowers or powers of the world, because there's only one superpower. But looking at their involvement and looking at what Morocco stands for and where it's at. I think we should all be very conscientious of Morocco being basically the only really Western country, so to speak, definitely in this particular region, Western oriented, stable, developed in a very, very good way, and the only country that I think we can all only rely on to do the right thing. And I think that they sense from time to time that they are not well enough appreciated for all of this. And it definitely comes back also to defense and military posturing and presence and cooperation and relying on them. So this is something definitely to be aware of, and something to note and actually to take action about. And in a way, this is also kind of the segue to what you asked, Jonathan, on our relations, and when we see the relations with Morocco also as some kind of I don't know whether to say stepping stone, but on the broader context of kind of having some more things within Africa. Now, it's no secret that Israel has very good bilateral relations with many, if not most, of the countries in Africa. And there are a lot of things that we're doing on development, and also even on defense, and definitely on in the economic sphere. But there is a huge advantage on working trilaterally together with Morocco, with its positioning within the region, the way that it's perceived, its strength and power, and the ability to combine things which, we come with the term of, national security issues. National security is not just the defense. It's not just, the arm, the military and so on. It's food security, it's energy security, it's all these things. And I think that with Morocco, the potential is so great to bring the whole package to other countries in the region. It can be through the AU as the AU, but also bilaterally with other countries with whom Morocco has has the good relations with. When I said baby steps earlier, this is because I think, first of all, we need to stabilize our bilateral relations to see that we have enough joint things going on together, that we have the trust, and then building on that with, and then working together towards, or with the third and fourth and fifth countries. Again, it can be done with the US. It can also, but it doesn't necessarily have to be done in this way. A lot of it will also depend on the US interests to be involved in these things. And I think that this is true for many countries in the region who also want kind of the love from the US side, and perhaps coming in trilaterally with this to other third and fourth and fifth countries sends a message, a very clear message. Also in this regard, again, and this is, if you want, mirroring what we are doing with the Emiratis, for instance, which is a totally different discussion, but things that we are doing, we have a trilat working group with them, which is economic and development projects that we're doing with the Emiratis in Africa. So if we're doing with the Emiratis, who are way out there, so even, the most natural thing is to do it with Morocco in this regard. And this is something that I would encourage, and for talks, again, not just bilaterally with Morocco, but also trilaterally with the US.
Oh, I have to jump in. Can I jump
Please.
in?
Please.
From your lips to God's ears. That actually is something that I have been thinking about, with Morocco being the largest investor in Africa, and with the US with a very different approach to Africa through AFRICOM, which is supposed to be integrating our efforts through USAID, through NGOs, etc. Of course, a different combatant command, but it always seemed to me that the best way for us to combine our efforts, Morocco as the lead for the African countries and the largest investor on the continent, with Israeli entrepreneurship, technical interest, and the whole continent at Israelis' feet as a place where its expertise regarding green, the Negev, and some of the other incredibly innovative water usage and other innovations, and with US partnership, what a force that could be to basically confront very weak Russian interest and the Belt and Road Initiative of the Chinese. We don't have the burden, if we could do something together, of having the predatory lending practices, and we're not going to be importing our own foreign workers. And by leveraging Morocco's role, for me, it would be a tremendous opportunity to invest in food security, water security. I'll leave it at that, but for me, it's almost a dream, but maybe within reach.
I'd like to, it's wonderful to hear some notes of optimism in the world right now. So I'd like to sort of keep digging away at that. Secretary Long, I guess, to look a little more prospectively, you mentioned the ways that the high potential for greater US involvement in promoting these types of cooperation and security. Are there certain policy things the United States can be doing, perhaps, that are relatively easy lifts to encourage some more of this cooperation, whether on the defense or diplomatic side?
Yeah, I'll be honest. I will do it from the point of view that the US isn't going to put anything more in its defense budget, or there's not going to be any grand augmentations in what it is willing or able to spend in Africa. Going into, let's say, the next 3+ years or thereabouts, particularly given what we see happening in Europe. I think any excess will go in that direction. I think from a defense perspective, I'll start there first. The leveraging of our relationships have not been fully utilized. And both my colleagues mentioned the fact that they're both now in CENTCOM. With the tyranny of geography, for what may be coming out of Africa through Libya and across over into Egypt and into the Middle East, I think there are a lot of border, maritime, air defense, and other capabilities and discussions about how we can work together to leverage some of the aspirations of some of the Maghreb countries, but also to really try to limit or mitigate what is going on in the Sahel. As the ambassador noted, the Trans-Sahel initiative, of course, being more in AFRICOM's area of opportunity, but perhaps pulling from both of those commands into a place where we could bridge the gap between what's happening in AFRICOM and CENTCOM to leverage one another's initiatives. And frankly, let's be honest, nobody can probably be used more effectively with the Palestinians in helping them appreciate that this really is a reset than the Moroccans. And that would come to a tremendous security benefit, not only for the Israelis, but to the region. So between the Moroccans and the other Arab countries, another place where we could help our security. Thirdly, I actually think that when it comes to the aggressive Daesh and the Al-Qaeda and other extremists in the region, it's going to take more leadership, renewed leadership. We've got the French pulling out of the Trans-Sahel initiatives and some of its presence, key presence in the countries down below our current line of demarcation, where the US doesn't do much and the French and others do. I think it is in the interest, frankly, of Israel and the other Arab countries to nip that in the bud, as far as the weapons and the training and frankly the expertise. These guys are getting combat experience out of Syria and other places, then aggregating there and then going only the Lord knows where. And the sooner we put the kibosh on that, the better. Those are the three that come to me immediately.
Thank you. And so I'm looking at the clock, and we've certainly breezed through our hour. So in respect of everyone's time, Ambassador Pham, I'd like to sort of ask you the same question, perhaps give you the closing word here. Building on what Secretary Long has said, what are there other things the United States can be doing or should be looking to do in a region that, as this discussion has shown, is markedly important to U.S. and Israeli security, but perhaps is, especially given events in Ukraine at the moment, is perhaps not getting the attention it should?
Well, thank you, Jonathan. I'll just make three brief points, picking up where Secretary Long left off. First, I agree with her. Given the global context, some dreamed up Marshall Plan or some big infusion of resources into Africa is unlikely to occur in the next couple of years. So we need to spend what resources we do have smartly and efficiently. And certainly that's building on the defense level, building on the relationships that already exist. Already, Morocco hosts, together with U.S. Africa Command, AFRICOM, the largest joint exercise the U.S. participates in Africa year in, year out. It's African Lion. And so, and that builds on not just the one exercise, but Morocco's deep relationships, the academies at Meknesh, the training that many African professional training that many African officers receive in Morocco and from Morocco. So we need to leverage this defense relationship further. Second point, defense is one component, security cooperation, important. In fact, I would argue it's the necessary component, but it's not the sufficient component. So the second point is the economic piece of this for security, the development, all these things, and we've talked about the opportunities, leveraging entrepreneurship from Israel, Morocco's deep commercial and investment relationships, and the private sector, the U.S. private sector as well. And they're increasingly investing in Morocco, but also from there with Morocco acceding to not just the African Union, but at the doorstep of ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West Africa States. So there are lots of opportunities on the economic front to develop bilaterally and certainly trilaterally. And then the final thing I would put is we also have to not be just obsessed. We should concerned, yes, but not obsessed with the present, but we need to look to the future. Africa is the continent of the future, not just because of it's aspirational, but because economic growth is faster there. Demographic growth by 2050, some of us will still be alive, hopefully. 2050, 1 in 4 working age persons on the planet is going to be an African. The mineral resources that we need for the 21st century, all of that is here. And so and there's other power competition as well as non-state actors. So we have to look to the future, and when the moment allows, also to continue making the point that these 3 partners, these 3 allies need to also work together to secure that future. Thank you.
Thank you. And that is as good a note to go out on, certainly as any. I'd like to thank all our panelists for their time today. And I'd also like to note especially that JINSA's policy analyst, Sam Milner, I'd like to thank him for the role he played in helping arrange all this and doing the legwork. I'd like to thank you, Mr. Benjamin, for joining us late Israeli time. We appreciate you staying on. And Secretary Long and Ambassador Pham, JINSA thanks you as well for your time today. Thank you all for joining and for taking time out of your busy days to listen to this enlightening discussion. And please stay tuned for future JINSA events. I believe with that, Harris, I turn the microphone back over to you.
Thanks, Jonathan. I think you have everything covered. We'll let you know about future JINSA Zooms in the next couple of days. So thank you, everybody, and the panelists. You did a great job. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you all.